Hello everyone and welcome back to the iProgress podcast. I'm Dean and I'm joined by Craig as always, and today we're going to be talking about things I wish I knew as an undergrad. So we're very conscious that we want to make this a very holistic community for everybody, and over the last couple of weeks we've been talking a lot about early career researchers and PhD students. So now we want to turn our attention to looking at undergrads because we're filming this on middle of August. And so it's going to be released just as students are going to be walking into university for their first ever semester. And so over the last couple of weeks, Craig and I have been accumulating lots of kind of hints and tips, and we've been talking to undergraduate students and master's students about what they wish they'd have known when starting out as an undergrad. And hopefully we can disseminate some of that information to you today. So in terms of our first topic, we always have 3 topics each week. I don't know if you've noticed. We're going to be talking about various learning techniques. Now, when I first started university, I was very kind of rigid in the way that I wanted to learn. Throughout my A-levels, I'd learnt various techniques which I thought were the bee's knees in terms of how best to learn, read, write, and generally, complete my academic duties and work. But I soon found that when I started my undergraduate degree, these weren't good enough. And we've spoken previously in the podcast series about how perhaps students aren't always fully prepared to walk into university. And that doesn't matter whether you're an undergraduate student, whether you're a postgraduate student, or whether you're going into your PhD in employment. But one thing that I wasn't told was that in my first 2 years, I should be using this as almost a playground or a sandbox to be trying out different ways of learning. Okay, so am I using big spider diagrams? Am I doing huge literature searches and then trying to fit all these papers and whatnot in similar boxes so that I can talk about it? Am I writing in the best way? Okay, so am I just starting from the start and then finishing at the end? And for those of you that's kind of watching all of our YouTube videos, you'll know that we have this 5 top tips for writing success. And our first kind of tip is to start at the conclusion, because that allows you to formulate your ideas. It allows you to really be specific about what you want your readers' take-home messages to be. And from that gives you a rigid structure that you can write your essays. And Craig and I use that all the time. It's a really beneficial way of writing, but I learned that in my PhD. I never learned that throughout my undergraduate degree. And one of the reasons for that was that I was never spurred on to try different learning techniques. And I almost feel that I did fine at university, but I feel that that was a slight disadvantage of me, that I was never pushed to try and do various things. And Craig, I know you've been putting together some packages to help our readers and viewers about how best they can really facilitate their undergraduate degree.
Yeah, I think just to reiterate what you were saying there, like we don't learn these soft skills necessarily about how to learn. We learn about content in our A-levels in the UK anyway, in our A-levels in our undergraduate degrees. We learn content typically. We don't learn about how to learn, how to revise quite often in second year. So I do kind of a lot of mentoring and tutorial based work in second year of our undergraduate degree. And one thing that I'm asked almost without fail every year is, how do I revise for exams? It's not what do I revise for exams or what's going to be on the exam. It's how do I revise for the exam? And I often think at that point it's too late, but we shouldn't be waiting until the end of the second year of a 3-year undergraduate degree to be talking about how to study. These things should be embedded throughout the entirety of the degree or the learning process. It's something that should really be taught pre-university, but it's just not something that we tend to do. So yeah, we've been developing some resources that's designed to get people to work effectively within their university context. So if you've seen me post anything on our social media channels, it will have probably contained the word workflow. I think workflow is really important in terms of how do you get from one particular point of not knowing anything about your degree or your topic that you're studying at that point through to having a complete set of notes where you're confident that you can recall information from that particular topic's content. One thing in particular that we're really keen to get people to start thinking about is how do they develop those workflows. One way that we think is really important or really useful is through an app called Notion. So Notion is a completely free software that you can get online. You can download it onto your computer. And what we've done is we've set up a complete academic planner. So it's got a place on there where you can have a dashboard of all of your current modules. If you hit complete on that module dashboard, that will automatically archive that module so you can go back and look at it at a later date. It's got a template on there where it will have a calendar view. So you can put all of your timetabled sessions, you can put all of your assessment deadlines, and you can see at a glance where all of your sessions are, where you need to be, and what all of your pinch points are. Because so pinch points are really important because they will severely kind of contract your time. But then within each of the module pages, what we've tried to do is to set it up so you can have a really clear way of thinking through all of the content within those modules. You can track any themes that are within the modules, who's teaching the module, at what point you are in your kind of notes making in relation to that, whether you've done your pre-lecture thinking, if you've done your post-lecture notes, if you're thinking through about what to revise, you can kind of mark that on there and you can see again at a glance where you're at in terms of your progress on that module. But equally, when you go into each of those sessions, there's also a notes template, which we really encourage our students to use in terms of thinking through their pre-lecture thoughts. So say, for example, you've got a 2-hour lecture on a particular topic. What you should be doing, ideally, is thinking about your views about that topic before you go into the lecture. Thinking through what do you already know or what are your assumptions about that topic. Within the lecture, I personally tell my students, don't feel like you need to make comprehensive notes within the session itself, because if you're doing that, you're not following the flow of the lecture. If you're just writing down what's on the slides, you may as well not be in the lecture because the slides are being made available for you anyway. So if you're noting down key bits of information, key definitions, that's enough in the session, as long as you're following the flow of that session. At that point, after the session, you should then be thinking about what your preconceptions were, what the story of that lecture was, and then thinking about how you can tie all of that together. There's spaces for recommended reading. So most people will give you recommended reading in particular topics. You can link to those papers. There's space for you to write notes on those papers. You can highlight things that aren't still clear. You can think about what potential essays might be posed in relation to different topics, and you can start planning your essays as well. What we've tried to do is to structure this in a way that is consistent with how we teach, how we would advise people to organize their time. And there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of information there that I've said in terms of a lot of different functions on that. But ultimately, these are individual pages that you can see at a glance in a really systemized way what it is that you're doing, what you've done, and what else you need to do. And I think if people can work from these workflows and have these really clear, systemized templates that they're working from, I think a lot of the time when people are revising, or if they're writing an essay or writing a report, just seeing that blank page is really off-putting. So if you have that template to start with, then what you can do is you can start to fill in those pre-populated sections to organize your time and to organize your writing so that you know at a glance where to go, and you don't have to think about what you're doing before you do it. You can just get on with the work of actually learning.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent overview, and I know we've been working hard putting that Notion template together, and the people that have kind of experienced it and used it already, really positive feedback about just how detailed the scope of it is and the depth that they can kind of go down in each individual element. They can really, I think one of the key cruxes for it is that you're able to pre-populate some of those elements with your preconceptions of the lecture and the material. I think you very well put there that one of the most daunting things when we do start to write our essays and when we do start to put our ideas together is that we oftentimes find ourselves on a blank page, which becomes quite daunting and kind of anxiety provoking when we're trying to write. And especially if we do have writer's block, just staring at the fact that actually we're basing our writing on nothing is a real inhibitor. And then going back to what you were saying in terms of the ability to kind of add notes to the lectures and link very clearly to the lectures, you're perfectly right. We're in a world now where within universities, our lecture notes are being delivered to students, 24 hours plus before the lecture starts. The majority of our sessions, unless they're kind of individual discussions, are being recorded and disseminated for students, so you can work asynchronously on that and you can go back and facilitate your learning that way. So the notes that should be being made within those sessions are those stories and those discussions that we all have with our students, all of that additional information which changes year on year. It changes in terms of the context which we're talking, and also the kind of students that we have and the debates that we grow within those classes. And I think that those are the notes that students should be making the most of, and highlighting those and being able to have a single place to document all of those within the context of additional lectures, within the context of the modules that they're working, and also as you were saying, you're able to archive existing modules, so you can even talk about it from year to year. And as a student, when you're reflecting back on it, you can see just how your educational journey has grown and developed throughout years 1, 2, and 3. And I think that's a real testament to the software. So we'll put a link in the description and the kind of crib notes, so that people can go and access that and hopefully try it out themselves. And if you do have any positive experiences or critical experiences, we're always open to developing. Please do let us know. We'd love to get some feedback on that. And so the kind of next element in terms of learning techniques for me is blocking out your study, as opposed to trying to fit your study, fit your learning, fit your essay writing into sections throughout the day when you just find the time. Okay, so one thing that I do on the start of each of my weeks, I've started to do this on a Sunday evening now, just so I can really hit the ground running on a Monday, is to block out time in my diary where I'm going to be in lessons, or I'm going to be in sessions, or I know that I need to be on emails or in office at a certain time. And then after I've got all of those immediate things out of the way, is to really put some decent blocks in my diary, block out the time before I even get to it, so that I can say, okay, so this is where I need to write this essay, or this is where I need to write this piece of research. And by having that pre-existing in my diary, I can turn off my emails. I'm not living out of my inbox. I probably have my emails open twice a day, each for 10 to 15 minutes, just so that I'm not getting distracted by those pings, because oftentimes when you're trying to get yourself into the headspace of writing or learning, you do get distracted. And obviously within that, it's very healthy to take breaks. I know there's the Pomodoro technique, whereby you learn for 50 minutes or 1 hour and 40, and then you have 10 or 20-minute break respectively. And that's something that I would really endorse. I think being able to give yourself a very clear goal, very realistic goal, a goal that can be easily measured and you can recognize when you've achieved that goal, and then setting aside time to sitting down and doing it can be very refreshing. Not only are you getting substantial pieces of work done at that time, but you're also getting that self-gratification in that, I have achieved this. There's something that I can tick off my to-do list, or I can check off my Notion list, that's kind of appended as what Craig was just talking. So before we move on to our second topic, Craig, is there anything else that you wanted to add there? Anything that's come to mind as we've been kind of talking?
Yeah, I think we speak quite often about the kind of time blocking technique and working really deeply. So I think neither of us are naive enough to think that a full-time university student is actually working, and there may be some, but actually working for 37, 38, 40 hours a week on their degree. I think any lecturer that does think that is probably being a little bit naive, to be honest. But what that means is that when people are working, then they should be working deeply. So if you are setting aside 3 hours a day to do your work, that's 15 hours. It's not a huge time envelope to work with. But if you are working for 3 hours in a really deep way, that's, according to some evidence, equivalent to about 6 or 7 hours of scattered work or distracted work. So if you can be really focused and block that time really well, what that means is that you can get the work done that you want to. You can achieve your potential in terms of your degree, and you can have that university experience that people are really kind of keen on in terms of socialization and just doing other things, volunteering, having work experience. You can get all of that work done in the same time envelope as long as you are working effectively. What people shouldn't be expecting to do necessarily is to work in the library with 15 tabs open for 3 hours and hope that all of that's going to go in, because it's just not. And I think we need to be honest with students about that. But if people can sit down in a non-distracted way and work for a couple of hours, 3 hours, taking obviously a couple of breaks to make sure that they're refreshed, then that's going to be really advantageous for people. I think thinking through other kind of really quick fire learning techniques, learning how to manage your references, having a reference management software like Zotero or RefWorks or Mendeley. If you can have a software package that works for you, then you're not then having to find resources for essays. You have them all there. You have your notes in one place. Importantly, you're not finding how do you reference in your essays as well. You're thinking through the fact that you're writing an argument and then you're putting your citation in and you're letting Microsoft Word or Mendeley or Zotero do all of the heavy lifting for you. And again, it's about these workflows. It's about how do you work smart as well as hard. And this is kind of the key theme in one of our earlier courses, actually. So people who are members of the iProgress community can have access to all of our educational resources, all of our courses. And one of the earliest ones that we've got is about getting started and working effectively at university. And some of these tips are really kind of rife, and we go into a lot more depth about them in that course. So if you are interested, you can sign up for either a free or a paid account, and you get access to a version of that course through our website.
Perfect. So going back to what you were saying about freeing up your time so you can undertake these kind of volunteering opportunities and kind of other research opportunities, that moves us perfectly well onto topic 2 by trying to endorse students to say yes to research or other experiences. Okay. From my experience, students kind of sometimes have regrets when they get to their 3rd year or their master's programs, whereby they reflect and say, well, actually, I wish I'd have done this. I wish I'd have been able to make the time to go and get this experience, or go and work on this paper, or go and ask somebody if I can help them out with something that I'm interested in. And we appreciate that it can always be quite difficult to both make that time. You know, we're in a world where you don't just have your kind of typical student body anymore. You know, there's lots of I don't want to use the word atypical because it's entirely correct, but we have a more non-traditional student body, you know, where perhaps they might be motivation rich but time poor. And so whilst we appreciate that, students who can make that additional time, they benefit so much from going out and getting those volunteering opportunities. They get so much from reaching out to a lecturer or academic and saying, okay, I'm really interested in your body of work. Have you got any upcoming research projects or studies that you need a little bit of help with? And taken from an academic perspective, we really love that. We really love people talking to us about our work, reaching out to us about our work, and just wanting to get involved. And it benefits us in that, you know, we might not have to do data collection over here, or we might not have to do some of the kind of preliminary statistics over here, especially for qualitative data. For me, we all know I'm garbage at it, but for the students, you're able to get that additional mentorship, you're able to get that one-to-one time with an academic, and also you're able to really give yourself an advantage, especially when you are in a research heavy degree and you're coming to your 3rd year and you're trying to put together a research project of your own. Actually having that experience working with an academic, drawing on their insight, and, you know, putting together a research project, a proposal, going to collect data, analyzing a little bit of that data, maybe even getting involved in some of the write-up, it can really put you in an advantageous position for when you do start your 3rd year.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point, actually, in terms of it's not just about the CV building aspect of these things. It's about the skills that you're developing along the way. So I think it's really nice when people come to me and ask me about my research. I think academics, to some degree, to do the to do the job kind of have to like the sound of their own voice a little bit. So any opportunity that I've got to talk about what I'm doing is a bonus for me. But equally, having those extra pair of hands is really good in terms of being able to get more research done, get more work done. And it's really nice when people show an interest in that at a really young age and at a really early point of their career. I think on the flip side of that, when people are very clearly doing that because they want to add a line to their CV, that gets really frustrating, I think, for academics, because at that point, it feels like people are slightly less invested in the quality of the work that is being produced. So it almost makes extra work for the academic in terms of having to check absolutely everything that's been done. But I think if people really throw themselves in to that kind of task, if they really engage, they're really motivated to do that, there's lots that not only the academic can get from it, but also the student in terms of exposure to what real research actually looks like. I think in research methods classes, it's quite a sanitized environment. You've got this kind of very mechanic, very systematic way of thinking about research that probably isn't quite as accurate as real research looks. So getting exposure to that process actually as it happens is really useful, but also thinking through how people think through analysis plans, how people plan writing, how to work with bigger teams of collaborators as well. So we've had students, for example, at our different institutions who have worked with both of us. And that's what that's ultimately done, is obviously worked for us in terms of publications and work for them in terms of publications, but equally has taught them how to work with people from different institutions, how those collaborations form, what that looks like from an organizational perspective as well. So there's lots of different skills, I think, that if people really want to learn them, if they really want to throw themselves into that context or into that task, then they can get a lot from it. And I think it's that investment. It's more about not just doing it to fill your CV, and more about really throwing yourself into it to get all of the skills that you can from that kind of task.
100%. And in some ways that actually bleeds back into last week's podcast, or the week before's podcast rather, about kind of academic well-being. And we recognize that academics don't always have the time to do as much research as they'd like. So actually forming these collaborations, be it with students and or with other academics from other institutions or their own institution, actually that can artificially reduce that workload if planned and implemented in a very appropriate way. And it can be really beneficial, not only for kicking out papers, but making yourself less burnt out. And as a well-intended and actually fantastic byproduct, in many cases it can also result in students getting kind of publications on their academic CVs, which from an institutional perspective looks fantastic, because you can be getting your undergraduate students published. For an academic, that can look really good on your CV, but for the student, that can only aid them walking into master's or PhD programs, but also just generally increase their employability if they would like, to take that industry position like we've talked about over previous weeks. So the third topic that I kind of wanted to talk about with you today is also the fact about utilizing feedback. Now, for those of you who hopefully are looking at this podcast and listening to this podcast who are in academia, you may be academics, you may be early career researchers who are providing feedback, we can agree that there is a huge push or a movement towards providing detailed, comprehensive and individualized feedback for students to help you grow at all stages of your study. Now, this is obviously about things that I wish I knew as an undergrad. And when I was an undergrad, we're talking over 10 years ago now. In fact, we're talking a lot longer than that, actually, about 15 years ago now. Wow. I got feedback. It wasn't as comprehensive as it is now. In many places, it wasn't individualized. And I was in a privileged position. I was doing quite well at university, so I perhaps didn't have to delve into as deep with certain elements of feedback as other students may have done. But I wish that I'd have known how to actually implement that feedback to the best of my ability. we know from kind of student accounts and academic accounts that perhaps not all students fully engage with the feedback as well as they could do. You know, the potential is always there to kind of do better, but the feedback is there for a reason. It's not just lip service, you know, that we're ticking a box, but we're generally developing this feedback to help students grow and to do better with assignments at all stages of study. So for me personally, and this is one of the main reasons to talk about this, I think that if, as a student, when you first get that piece of feedback, you really want to take a few seconds to digest it, to understand what that feedback means, both in terms of wider general feedback, but also individualized comments which are being presented throughout that essay or that assignment or that research project. Okay, do you fully understand each and every point that's being presented to you? If you don't, that's perfectly fine. You know, there's always kind of cognitive dissonance sometimes between lecturers and their students. If you don't fully understand something, put a little bit of a mark next to it, write it down, you know, put it into your Notion template book to come back to later. And when you have read through the feedback comprehensively, you've reread your assignment, you've looked at the feedback, and that's when you need to start coming to the conclusion is, okay, so do I know how, if I was given this same assignment again, do I know how I could have improved it? And then when you've answered that question, then you need to be looking to the future. Okay, so actually, if I'm given a similar assignment to this on a similar topic, do I know how to take this feedback and apply it to that assignment? Now, it'd be very naive of us to say that every academic produces the best possible feedback they can do. And it'd be very naive of us to say that every institution has firm standardized feedback, but this is something that we're very much pushing for. It's important to have standardized feedback across assignments, across lecturers, to make sure that students can fully get to grips with that feedback as and when it comes to them. But the take-home message from me is to make sure you understand that feedback, make sure you understand how to apply that feedback, and if that you don't, then please do reach out to your lecturers or markers for further guidance. That's perfectly fine to do. If something doesn't really click with you, your marker will want you to ask questions so that you can improve in the future.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of those things. I think I had a slightly different experience to you, Dean, at university. I didn't start particularly well at university, so for our UK kind of listeners, I started off with 2 2s at university. For our American viewers, that's probably a C, something like that, C minus maybe. So I wasn't failing, but I wasn't doing what I possibly could have done. And the one thing that I really tried to do was to engage with the feedback that I was getting. So there were different things. So I didn't have effective workflows, for example. I didn't have a way of working. I was just kind of getting an assessment brief, getting an assessment outline, and sitting with a blank piece of paper and thinking, okay, what was in that lecture? What was in that session? I'll write that and I'll try and put some of my own thoughts down, and hopefully that'll be enough. And it wasn't. So yeah, really engaging with some of the feedback that I was getting was really important at that point. Reaching out to lecturers, like you've said, Dean, thinking about what they say I need to do to kind of improve that grade. And over time, that is something that happened. It's not the sort of thing that will happen straight away. I think it's really important to acknowledge that it's very unlikely that you're going to go from, if you're in the UK, a third to a first within the space of one essay. It might be that you go up from a third to a high 2-2, from a high 2-2 to a mid to a high 2-1, and then onto a first, maybe within the space of 6 or 12 months. That's quite conceivable that you could do that if you're developing effective workflows and you're engaging properly with feedback. I think from a lecturer's perspective, I often think if I'm going to be investing time in giving quite detailed feedback, and I quite like giving quite detailed feedback, to be honest, because I like to see development in students, but equally, from a selfish perspective, a good essay is much easier to mark than a less good essay. So I think from a marker's perspective, you can give really detailed feedback to get someone from a low 2-1, a high 2-1 to a first, and that's going to take much less time than it is trying to get someone from a third to a 2-2, for example, because of the base level of knowledge. So if you can over time be using that feedback to kind of scaffold your skills, it's going to be really important for you. And if that's not clear on feedback, then definitely ask the marker for extra feedback or for clarifications. The one thing that I would say don't do is to start querying grades, because ultimately marking is an art rather than a science. I think this is one thing that I've kind of, my thinking on this has developed over time, in that you could conceivably have two different lecturers marking the same essay, and that they give not wildly different grades, but somewhat different grades. It might be a high 2-2 for one person and a low 2-1 for another. Now, ultimately, that could have an impact on somebody's final grade. It's probably not going to have that much of an impact in the grand scheme of things, but it could kind of, from a psychological perspective, have an impact on how someone feels about a particular piece of work. But ultimately, focusing on the grade itself is less important than looking at the feedback that you've been given. So that feedback is going to be much more conducive to your own growth. It's going to be much more conducive to your own development. So I don't want to say don't think about the grade, because obviously people are going to think about the grade. I've heard some people suggest that maybe we should stop giving people grades and just give them feedback, which I think is an interesting idea and not something that I think students particularly enjoy. But if that was one way that people went, then potentially there'd be more emphasis paid to the feedback itself rather than the grade. I think it'd be quite easy for some people, if you're receiving an A grade or a first in the UK, to think, well, I don't really need to look at that feedback because I've got the highest grade that I can possibly get. Whereas actually, if you do look at the feedback, you can see what you've done well and how you can then translate that into other pieces of work as well. So thinking about the feedback that you get is much more important than the grade that you actually get, particularly in the first and second year.
Yeah, perfect. And I think that I think going back to that kind of that idea about is there a world where we don't give grades is actually something we can talk about in a future podcast episode, because I feel it does deserve a deep dive, and I've got a couple of opinions about that as well. But I think to kind of round off Craig's point there, it is very unlikely that a particular grade will impact the degree overall, and because of that, emphasis should be paid on the feedback itself rather than the grades. And I know I can sit here and say this from kind of my position now. I reflect back when I was a student, and actually if I did get a grade which I wasn't expecting, so a grade which was much lower than I expected, actually that was really demoralizing, and I felt that demoralization and those kind of that negative affect even before I'd gone and looked at the feedback to try and understand better about what led the marker to that grade. And so definitely, you know, the grade is important, but don't let that put you off. Don't let that disconnect you from spending time looking at that feedback, because ultimately it's that feedback which is going to contribute to you absolutely smashing your degree and leaving your undergraduate or master's degree, you know, with the highest possible grade that you could get at that space in time. So perfect. So that brings us to the end of episode 4, a slightly shorter one this week, but I feel that hopefully it's useful enough to help our undergraduate students to fully engage and put you in the best possible position for walking in to your undergraduate degrees this year. If you are a existing student listening to this, or you're a master's or PhD student, please do get in touch with us in the comment section and, you know, over social media to let us know what your top things would have been to add to this list when you'd have started academia. And obviously we're taking this from a very UK perspective, so for our international viewers, are things different for you? What would you have liked to have learned? And actually I think over the next few weeks we're going to be starting more discussion in terms of trying to better understand this internationalization, you know. So actually the information that we're giving, try to make it as applicable as possible to all of our viewers and listeners around the world. So thank you very much, everyone. Once again, keep following those socials. It really does help us out. And we'll be back in a couple of weeks' time talking to you about the peer review process, the ups, downs, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And Craig and I will have a story about what we think is the best paper that we have ever written, which sadly, for whatever reason, we cannot get published for the life of us. Hopefully, maybe this podcast will be an avenue for someone to reach out for us and offer to publish it on our behalf. That would be absolutely splendid. So we'll catch you in a couple of weeks' time. Thank you very much.